What's up, everybody? Welcome to the In the Scope podcast. I am your host, Joshua M. Hicks, senior writer for War Media, and I have a very special guest here with me tonight. He is a former Washington Post writer, but also currently ESPN.com/The Undefeated writer, Michael A. Fletcher. Mr. Fletcher, how's everything going on with you?
Oh, well, everything's good here, man. Things are good here in Baltimore. A little humid and hot, but we're making it.
I totally understand.
A little COVID crazy, but hanging by a thread at least.
Oh, I totally understand, man. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it, especially you being a mentor of mine in this industry, and eventually trying to get to that. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's a pleasure for me.
Most definitely. We have obviously a variation of topics to jump in, but first off, we're just going to talk about the biggest thing that's really taken over the airwaves and the media from a topic perspective is obviously social justice. COVID has obviously shut pretty much the whole country down, and as we're still trying to eventually slowly but surely get back into the swing of things, sports is one of those industries that have been affected by COVID. But it also could have been for the better or for worse. Obviously, recently, as soon as we're currently recording this podcast, the Big Ten, the Pac-12, big conferences that have been vocally coming out saying we're canceling fall sports and we're postponing those fall sports to the spring. But even in a more professional setting, like the NBA, the NFL, COVID actually could have been a blessing in disguise just from a protesting perspective. We have seen over the past few months NBA players that have been very vocal, and not just being vocal, but actually out in the trenches, in the forefronts of these marches, protesting for social justice and change, saying Breonna Taylor's name, justice for George Floyd. How much of an impact does COVID, not obviously negatively, we know the impact that it has made, but how much of a positive impact has COVID played specifically for these social justice discussions, these and the actions behind those justice movements, like the marches that we've seen from athletes joining these protests?
It's an interesting question, man. I think you're right. Even though COVID, we can go on forever listing the negative impacts, but I think the fact that the world is kind of slowed, right, in a way, and the interest of the world has narrowed. And it's focused in on some of this activism with the murder of George Floyd. As you point out, you see Jaylen Brown driving to Atlanta to lead a march. If the Celtics were in full swing, he couldn't do that. And we probably wouldn't even cover it the same way, even sports media, general media, because there'd be so many other things going on. But obviously COVID's a big story, but there hasn't been that much else. And obviously with the social justice thing, that I think has provided a focus. You see the NBA is back now. And everywhere you look, even the commentators, sometimes it even feels forced, to be honest. Like the commentators are talking about, say her name, education reform, what that may imply, the various slogans on the backs of the jerseys. And I think it's getting the kind of time and attention that it's deserved for so long. I worry a little bit about the embrace. Like, it's such a wide embrace, and it's become, like, so many things in our country commercialized a little bit. Like, when people say Black Lives Matter, and maybe I've just been around too long, but I feel a little suspicious, right? I worry that, do people really know what they're saying in the sense of, like, the deep implications therein? I mean, I think people, I want to believe the best. People believe that on one level, but do they understand, okay, if that really matters, a lot has to change. And I'm not sure that people quite grasp that. There's a certain kind of, PR, corporate speak that goes on in this country. But nonetheless, back to your question, if there weren't COVID, I don't think you would have this focus. And, in a way, it's good to have this focus. WNBA players out front. I would say they're the number one group in terms of being, woke, not just to, like, sort of messaging and talking about things, but actually doing stuff and the substance of what they do. I mean, I think they're the leaders of the pack, if you will. But it's been, if there's a silver lining in COVID, I think it's given overdue attention to these issues.
You brought up a lot of good points that I'm eventually going to highlight. So I appreciate that. But
Okay.
let's start with one of your first points as far as the NBA and their current roles within their forms of showing justice and showing support for the Black community with obviously the jersey names, Black Lives Matter, having Black Lives Matter on the courts,
Right.
Black Lives on the jerseys. I actually want to highlight the point that you mentioned because to me personally, even though I am supportive of the uniform movement that they did with the Black Lives Matter, education reform, peace, putting some of those terms on the back of the jerseys, I also feel like that movement kind of got diluted because of the fact that they didn't necessarily allow them to fully pick all of the potential names that they would have wanted on the jersey.
Right, you kind of have these pre-approved slogans, right? I mean,
right.
and then slogans because these are real issues. But but there's kind of a defined sort of universe of slogans that you can wear on your jersey, and I'm with you. I think that says something there. But to me, I take it a step further. I agree with LeBron on this. Like these issues to me are so profound and go so deep that you can't write on the back of my jersey at least like what I want to say. I might just put Fletcher on the back of my jersey and then talk about these issues, when given the opportunity to in an interview. And even more than that, talking is one thing, because I think the message is out there. You have to do something, right? And you see what LeBron's doing about sort of voter education and voter turnout. Whatever it is, his school, that's the kind of action that I think is required. Because it's one thing to say, oh, I want to wake people up, I want people to know. But I think people do. I mean, who in America has not heard the phrase Black Lives Matter at this point? It's a question of, okay, what am I going to do to put that slogan into action, to show the depth of my conviction about this? That's how I kind of look at that. So it's fine. You write Black Lives Matter on the court. I mean, it's better it be there than not, I guess. But to me, it's kind of in a weird way, easy to do, particularly now because it's so kind of, there's no edge to it now. It's kind of the thing to do. It's almost more controversial if you don't do it. And I worry a little bit about that.
And that's a good point for the controversial aspect because that's why I asked about COVID. Because imagine if all this was still going on without COVID. You may not get the same attention, or honestly, I think it'd be that much even more impactful because society's back up and running. And when we have these type of issues previously, they just gone swept under the rug. It wasn't as much constant conversation and constant debate, whether it's through regular conversation, whether it's through television, things and radios and different outlets you can actually hear about these situations and let it stick to you.
Right.
So I wonder, even with that, even with the fact that COVID did obviously create the opportunities for us to do that, are we going to have that same whereabouts, that same movement, that same energy when society does get back up and running?
Man, I hope we do. And, and it feels like it, maybe there's a chance this time. I mean, as long as I've been around it, this has been the most impactful social movement that I've seen since I've been an adult. I was there. I was at the Million Man March. I've covered a lot of civil rights leaders. I covered President Obama, the first African American president. But this sort of mobilization that you see right now, and I think all the sports are just kind of reflecting the broader society when it comes to this, has been a sustained effort. And I think your point about COVID is right. I think COVID's kind of feeding that a little bit, but in a way, that's the momentum you see. I mean, protesters are still out there in Portland, Seattle. You may agree or disagree. I know I agree and disagree with some of the tactics. I disagree with what happened in Chicago the other day, but it still shows you that, there's this energy out there. There's this kind of unrest that I think COVID is feeding, but it also shows, I think, the level of concern that people have about what's happening. You see what's happening in the political arena. You see some of these Democratic primary results in the Congress. A couple of these old line Democrats are getting knocked off by progressives, and you may not disagree. Maybe you think they have the right way or the wrong way, but nonetheless, it shows a new energy that I think is being sustained. And whether that I think it's going to continue for a while. But this election is going to say a lot too. The upcoming presidential election, because I can only imagine how deflating it would be if the current president won re-election. Because I think people would just kind of go nuts. It's funny. My wife, he was just watching. We're talking about Kamala Harris being picked as VP. And we're watching CNN as we're having dinner, and my wife said, "Turn on Fox and see what they're talking about, just to get a sense of like what the deal's going to be." Turn to Fox. They were talking about Chicago, and they had these very sympathetic interviews of shop owners whose shops have been looted, and and they're not only did they have to deal with the COVID shutdown, now they're dealing with cleaning up for the second time from looting and this kind of stuff, and they're talking about crime out of control, and that sort of thing, and there's an element of reality, not that crime's out of control, but that okay, these people have a story to tell, and it tells you what Trump's playbook's going to be in a weird way. So you wonder how all that's going to come into the mix. They quote some women who say, I guess Jesse Jackson said something along the lines that he's ashamed of what happened. And yet, you have young people, I don't care what Jesse says, he's basically an old man kind of thing. And you wonder how all that's going to play out, because you think about elections, I've covered enough of them to know it's the old folks who vote, in the biggest numbers. Hopefully young people come out. Maybe, like I'm saying, it's a different time, and maybe that'll carry over. But I think there are a lot of open questions, right? And so if all this momentum does carry over to the polls, if people aren't so disaffected that they say it doesn't matter, if you vote. I mean, I'm still, my one beef with Cap from 2016, Cap was like, Trump, Hillary, all the same to me. I'm like, no, brother, they're not the same, but so let's hope people are, you kind of more tuned in on that, and more, at some level, you have to become a little pragmatic about it. Like, this is your choice, you know what I mean? You have A and B or C, and you got to choose one. This because it's going to be one of these three. It's going to be A or B. So you got to choose. If you don't choose, you're basically, as they say, there's no such thing as not voting. Like, you don't vote, you kind of voted. So anyway, I know I'm rambling for you, Joshua.
No, it's all good information, man, and that's the these are the type of discussions that we need to have. So yeah. I'm all for the rant, and give us all the knowledge you can, man. Our audience needs it. Our audience needs it for sure. But I'm gonna bring this back to the NBA, and I'm gonna talk about the actual protesting side of things, because there, for the most part, the majority of players and coaches and staff actually have knelt during the national anthem. But you do have a couple outsiders. Jonathan Isaac from the Orlando Magic did stand up. Myers Leonard from the Portland Trailblazers stood up, obviously for different reasons, and they explain those reasons later. But you can show that there was a sign of unity, but maybe doing things in a different way. My question to you would be, has those specific decisions hurt the message that the NBA is trying to portray? Could it have hurt it? Did it impact it in any way, shape, or form?
I think not, because what I've read about Isaac and Myers Leonard and even Coach Pop, those people had the support of their kneeling teammates. They kind of made their feelings known. From what I understand, Myers Leonard has military family, and they take a different view of kneeling, even though we all know the kneeling's not about disrespecting the military or anything like that. But he felt like, hey, I got to stand up for, because they do this. And, I think if I'm remembering right, maybe they, some of his teammates embraced his legs. So I think there was this kind of communication and kind of an openness, which I think we're going to need, because we're not going to all be in lockstep about everything. Because there's an argument to be made. Okay, so you kneel. Okay. Then you get up and play a basketball game. What have you changed in the world? You know what I mean? You can argue about that. Kneeling is not the gesture that it was 2 years ago. It's kind of the thing to do now. So is it kind of a rote kind of deal, or is it really symbolic of, of something else? So I don't think I think it actually enhances their message, because it shows a level of tolerance and a level of thoughtfulness. I think that every protest movement needs.
Interesting point that you brought up about the symbolism between kneeling, because when Cap did it, it wasn't the norm. That's what made the protest that much more profound, because he did it when no one else was doing it, and now everybody's saying we should take a knee. We can talk about how historically the knee was actually part of the civil rights movement. Dr. King protested in need, in a sense, to where it may not be in a football arena or in a sports arena to where it can be more notarized, but he did knee in protest even at, I believe, even at the Edmund Pettus Bridge when he was over there. He in the movie Selma, he prayed and kneed to God before he backtracked on that. So the symbolism between the knee and protesting, I just think that because of the fact that people are now realizing that it's such a historic, symbolic gesture now when you want to get a certain message across, that it also dilutes the formation of the protest. I think that plays a role in it as well.
And I think you're right. And I think every protest movement, I think there's an evolution, right? Cap started this, at least in the sports arena. Obviously, Black Lives Matter was rolling before Cap knelt, but nonetheless, he brought new life, new energy, and brought it into kind of into the sports realm in a way that I think has changed sports forever. We used to talk about activism in sports. It would be the one-off athlete who did this, but now most athletes are, at least, if nothing more than mouthing a social message, they're doing that. And I argue that they're doing much more than mouthing it. But if that's the minimum, they're doing that. And 2014, who was talking about that? And we all love Michael Jordan, but we know his story, right? So things, he changed things forever, and the kneeling was big then. And it's good to see now in a way, but another way, I'm like, well, it's not the sort of militant gesture that it was in 2016, certainly. It's the mainstream message. But it is breathtaking to look around the world, and it's become kind of a global gesture, and that's something to behold, I think. But nonetheless, I think now, like, back to that evolution, like, you have to ask, well, what's next? What are we doing to really make the change we're talking about? And let's try to even understand the change that we're seeking. It's one thing to say, oh, we want their knees off our necks. Well, let's get a little more specific. What do we want to do? What do we want our society to look like? And let's try to push, what are the mechanisms for making that happen? Who are the elected officials, if we still believe in that, who are most apt to, stand up for that? How are we going to support them? What's the meaning of democracy? I mean, it's not just I go vote November 3rd. It's like my city councilman hears from me. Maybe I go down to City Hall. It's a little inconvenient to go to a hearing if they're talking about doing something in my neighborhood that I don't like. I mean, if it's something as simple as I want a stoplight on the corner because a kid got hit by a car 2 weeks ago, you got to, there's a process. You got to make that happen. And people need to have that awareness and need to feel that power, because you actually, it resides, it's there. The power is there to be taken. It's there to be grabbed. I remember I used to cover Kwesi Nkrumah. He's back in Congress now, and he was the 7th District Congressman in Baltimore for a long time before Elijah Cummings took the seat. Then Elijah Cummings passed, and Nkrumah ran for the job again. He had gone off and become an NAACP leader and things like that. But he used to have this line in his speeches. Sometimes we're like beggars sitting on bags of gold. Sometimes you have to look around and see the resources you have and figure out how do you tap those. And there's no greater resource than one another. Like, if we could stand together as a community and do stuff and decide what it is we're trying to do, and it's not going to be perfect, unanimity. We're not going to all agree about everything, but we could agree about a lot of things. And, just 8 people in a room trying to do something is so much more powerful. It's like a multiplier effect, to 1. It's like 8 to the 8th power. It's really it really has that kind of exponential impact. And this is what I think that's the next step for our community, I would like to think. And a lot of people are doing that, don't get me wrong, but you need almost sort of more of that. I know protest is exciting. In a way, it has the feel of cutting edge and all of that, but it's almost the more day-to-day kind of slog of governance and making change that really is going to change lives. And that's what we have to get to and come to understand and make people feel empowered that they can make it happen. And that's the thing that people don't feel. They feel like it doesn't matter because if you look around in their lives, it feels apparent that it doesn't matter, but it really isn't true. I mean, it's there. You got it, but you have to, you kind of have to grab that power and make it work.
Everybody listening right now, you are tuning in to ESPN's The Undefeated, Michael A. Fletcher. Mike, you highlighted a little bit about how the WNBA has been very vocal and very big advocates of social change, and you pretty much argue they could be doing more. being from an impactful perspective than any other league in the professional realm. And I mean, they like you said, they've been very bold. They walked off the court during the national anthem. They came to the game saying, "Vote for Reverend what's his name from Atlanta, Reverend Raphael Warnock, who is running
against the owner of their own team, the Atlanta Dream." That's right.
Exactly.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
how has go more in depth as far as the WNBA's antics when it comes to protesting, and more specifically with the Atlanta Dream's owner, who did come out against the WNBA and basically said Black lives don't matter. At least the movement doesn't. How do you think they should handle that?
I mean, I think the sisters of the women, not just the Black women, the women in the WNBA have stood again. It's that power of unity. They've stood together against that. Like the owner of the Dream, a part owner. I mean, she's a U.S. senator, very rich woman from Georgia. Okay, she's rich. That's fine. She feels like Black Lives Matter is kind of un-American. And you've heard these talking points before, right? Because you go to the charter. There's some things that Black Lives Matter charter about the nuclear family and about capitalism, things that people may disagree with. But on the ground, we know what that movement means. Like Black Lives Matter is just what those words mean. So the owner of the Dream, and the part owner, says, no, this isn't cool. We should have an American flag. We should stand up for the principles of America. And she has a right. I mean, that's her view, right? But the women of her team, like as you pointed out, they weren't cowed by that. They stood up to her. You said about voting for her opponent. And they had to drive her nuts, and they did it in a way that was, I think, in its own way, respectful but strong, and it had a substantive point to it. And what could you say? Because it wasn't like they were out of order in the sense of, we're gonna just call each other names or be whatever, be like how social media can be like, I'm gonna whatever, I'm gonna just insult you. But let's actually bring some substance to the table, and you see the power of that. Because from what I've read, nothing's happened to those players. I mean, maybe I've missed something, but they kind of did it, and they're just moving on, right? So I'm proud of those ladies.
Yeah, and I think we have to give more credit to the people that actually run these leagues, that are in charge of these leagues. Adam Silver, of the NBA, he's very much a player's owner. He's someone that advocates for the players and for the athletes. So for him to work with the athletes to make sure they produce these campaigns that they've been doing, especially along with the WNBA, you have to give them major props and credit for that. And compared to franchises like in the NFL, where the NFL is a completely different story. You have ownership that doesn't always support those antics, and we know that from Colin Kaepernick's story.
And what a point. And what's interesting is the NFL does a lot of stuff, but it doesn't seem to accrue to much. They've put a lot of money into some social justice organizations. It's up to $250 million, which that's a nice chunk of change for an entertainment group, which is essentially what the NFL is. But I think your point is the key one. Like the NBA has this kind of image, and it's more than an image. The reality is they have kind of a working relationship with the players. They see the players as partners in the league. And the NFL is more of a hierarchy. It's a top-down situation. Roger Goodell, people say he's a decent guy, but doesn't really control the owners. And the owners, a lot of them are very conservative. We know about some of these guys, big donors to at least Trump's inauguration, some to Trump's campaign. So it's a different dynamic, I think, between the players and the owners. Irony being, NBA, you're talking about kneeling. NBA actually had a rule, like you're supposed to stand during the national anthem, right? NFL didn't have that rule. And it's funny, but the image is so different. I think a lot of it has to do with just what you said, like the sense of partnership does not flow from the NFL. It's like that word owner. When they had that movement, like not to use that word owner, I kind of chuckle because that's what they do own a team. But I get it in the sense that NFL owners try to act like they actually own you. You know what I mean? And I mean that's what they convey. Now, obviously, they don't. They're paying you big money to play football, but they have a different kind of working relationship with their workforce.
and let's continue conversations about the NFL. I mean, I wrote an article that I know I shared with you about Jay-Z and his role within the NFL. From my understanding of the whole situation, the NFL hired Jay-Z to help bridge that gap between society, African Americans in the NFL, and their social justice initiatives, as well as obviously doing other stuff like the entertainment for the Super Bowl and things of that sort. But watching all these events transpire since Kaepernick all the way up until now, like you said, they put their money where their mouth is as far as supporting other social justice initiatives and charities, but transferring onto events that may occur on the field hasn't always been applicable. So I asked Jay-Z, what's the next steps? Because you have been hired to basically help represent not just the African Americans and players in the NFL, but society as a whole that watch the NFL and have criticized the NFL's leadership for their lack of diversity, their lack of understanding to work with athletes and the handling of those situations. I asked them, what's next? In your opinion, what is the next step the NFL that should take regarding this, especially if they really protest this year, which a lot of athletes have been provocative and very outspoken in saying that they will be protesting during the season?
I know. I mean, that's a great question. I mean, because what has Jay-Z done? It feels like this whole relationship that was sort of hatched between Jay-Z and the NFL, it fell off the rails right at their opening press conference when it was announced. And Jay-Z's words, and and while you can agree with them factually, they were a little tone deaf. We've moved beyond kneeling. We need to move on to actionable items. I actually agree with that in a factual way, but that wasn't the moment to say that, particularly as Colin Kaepernick, the man who started this movement, the man who, if without him, you would not be sitting next to Roger Goodell, talking about, and let's talk about this other thing, this weird kind of hybrid. You do entertainment and you do social justice. Like what? It feels like two things to me. Like those are different trains running, right? But Kaepernick being, let's call it what it is, blackballed from the league. How do you say that? And I get it. Jay-Z said, well, you know what? Kaepernick took the settlement. It doesn't look like he wants to play. And then later on with that abortive tryout, a lot of people said Jay-Z was the one who was responsible for making that happen. And I don't want to knock Jay-Z here because he's done a lot through his life. And he's used his celebrity in a good way through the years. And I think he's sincere. He really wanted to do, he wants to move to the substance, right? He wants to do, okay, what's next for Jay-Z is I'd like to see actual improvement. I want to see a change in the law in Pennsylvania so you won't have another Meek Mill on probation forever. I want to see, we've seen in this country over the last 10 years, the incarceration rate's going down just a little bit. I want to see that accelerate and go down more. At the same time, I want our communities to be safe. All the things we all want. So I think Jay-Z wants that. But how do you achieve that? I mean, it's through the NFL. I mean, NFL is just NFL. I mean, it's huge. It's the biggest sports, enterprise in the country, but it's still just the NFL. It's not the U.S. government, and even the U.S. government, can't make all of that happen. But Jay-Z, I think, like I said, it just kind of ran off the rails at the beginning, in my view. It's hard to tell, what's going on now. You want to inspire change. And the NFL, from what I understand, I mean, the guys in the Players Coalition, they were already working with the league. So you could almost ask yourself, well, what was Jay-Z doing? That's almost a third wheel on this sort of NFL social enterprise bus. And it's hard to maneuver with three wheels. So, we'll see what happens, but it's I think you're onto something there because that's a good question. I think everyone's well intended. Let me just reiterate that. I mean, I want to say it again, Jay-Z's done a lot, in other venues, but it just seems tough because you feel like the NFL's move was really a PR move. They're looking to get this global figure, this entertainment mogul to sort of give them cover and help, maybe people will forget that I blackballed, we blackballed Colin Kaepernick. That's kind of what they went for. But, and they spent a bunch of money, but it's kind of backfired. They're still perceived the way they're perceived. And I think in the long run, I mean, they're doing well, still making a bunch of money and everything. But I think a younger generation is coming up that may not embrace the NFL the way my generation did, and even people younger than me. I think they can see the future is kind of leaning toward the NBA, and I think they want to, they want that sort of shine of kind of being hip and with it, and really being on the right side of history. That's what it boils down to.
No, that's true, but we also know that, like you mentioned before, the NFL is pretty much like a PR game with them, and pretty much everything socially conscious when it comes to social consciousness within American society. They always have somehow to play a PR game. I mean, another situation that came up aside from obviously the justice for George Floyd situation and things of that sort was Shaun Jackson's anti-Semitic comments. I mean, Shaun Jackson speaking out obviously in regards to his comments made by Minister Lou Farrakhan, Minister of the Islamic community, and that blew up even more, not just because of the fact that he said it, but Stephen Jackson, who's a former NBA player, and is literally one of the main faces of this justice movement with George Floyd, backs him up. And it caused a whole discussion and almost a divide in fighting against what Shaun Jackson's comments were saying, but also remaining focused on the true message, which was, quite frankly, fighting for social justice, again, the social justice for George Floyd. You as of recent, wrote a column on the Shaun Jackson's comments, and there's an interesting point as I pull it up here that you briefly mentioned that I kind of want to read real briefly, if you don't mind. You basically said, Farrakhan's Nation of Islam is widely admired across Black America for its 90-year track record of lifting up and cleaning up Black Lives Matter and its emphasis on Black self-help. Many African Americans look past Farrakhan's frequent forays into mind-bending conspiracy theories and his long history of anti-Semitism to focus on what they see as his core message. That has long been a sore point in Black-Jewish relations. Through the years, a series of Black leaders have attempted to forge partnerships with Farrakhan in the hope of tapping into his broad grassroots appeal, and were criticized for minimizing or ignoring his anti-Semitism rather than acknowledging it for what it is. Go more in depth as far as what you meant by that statement and how it applies to Shaun Jackson's comments against, at that point, even though he wasn't trying to make it degrading, but at the same time, sort of degrading comments towards the Jewish community.
Yeah, because Shaun Jackson, as people remember, posted some track that was allegedly, it turned out it wasn't a Hitler quote, but he thought it was a Hitler quote. And I can't remember what it says as I sit here now, but it was basically an anti-Semitic thing. And try to say it wasn't anti-Semitic. It was like almost self-evidently that. And then sort of as an aside mentioned, on the 4th of July weekend, Farrakhan had given a speech, I think up in Michigan, as Michigan State. And, sort of an annual speech that Farrakhan does, and talked about how the minister's speaking truth. And, I'm someone who's followed Farrakhan for years. I remember the first time I saw Farrakhan, I was a teenager living in New York City. And I forget, we were in this place, Rochdale Village, man, and we're out there playing basketball. And they said somehow some brothers came out and said he's speaking inside the community center, and I went to see him speak. And it was, Farrakhan, I don't know if you've ever been to a speech, like 2.5 hours of, sort of mesmerizing speech. And there's so many good points that Farrakhan makes. And the thing that I think so many brothers and sisters find appealing is, he's talking about, like, a little bit what I was talking about earlier, like, except he could do it so much more effectively. Like, we have a lot of power as a people. If we, unity, if we stick together, there's a lot we can do to lift ourselves up. But then he'll sprinkle in, like, sort of like conspiracy theories and stuff that I think most people maybe are not with it, you know what I mean? And there's the whole theology of the Nation of Islam, which, it's like a lot of theologies, like you have to just believe it or you don't. It's hard, you can't prove it because it's not scientific. And I guess you believe it or you don't, so Farrakhan has had this kind of dual thing. Like, he's been, again, and the Jewish community is going after him because he goes after them, and they're very organized and they go after him. But at the same time, you can't disregard Farrakhan because he has his pulse, I think, on the community. I mean, he knows he has an appeal to sort of everyday Black folk, and the Nation of Islam has been like that for a long, long time. So, with the Shaun sort of embracing what Farrakhan said, and some of the stuff he said was, I don't think it was really, I mean, I don't know what people think, but he was saying, for example, I prayed for, COVID to be, Florida to become like a center of the COVID outbreak and things like that. People, I'm like, what? I think people like, what? But people kind of, they push that aside to focus on, as I wrote there, his core message. And that's going on with Farrakhan forever. I mean, this Million Man March, I covered that in 1995. Literally, at least 1 million people on the Washington Mall at the time, one of the largest mass gatherings in D.C. history. Before it happened, a lot of elected officials, black elected officials, were saying, oh, this is going to be a mess. It's going to be all this violence. It's going to be, just crazy. It was anything but. It was the most orderly, sort of dignified day on the mall that I can remember. When that rally was over that day, the mall, I don't think there was a cigarette butt in the grass. I mean, it was just like disciplined and orderly and, and it had a lot of speakers and all of that. And people left, more importantly, black men left there saying, yeah, I'm going to go home to my community and try to make a difference. Now, we can argue about, well, how long did that feeling last or whatever, but it was clearly a positive message there. And among the people at the Million Man March was pre-presidential, Barack Obama, right? He come from Chicago to go to the march. And that kind of, I think, sort of exemplifies Farrakhan's reach. Yeah, people like Obama, looked at him and said he has something going on. Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice, has spoken well of Farrakhan in the past, before he was on the high court. But, he kind of said, yeah, this brother has something going on. So there's this kind of dilemma that Farrakhan presents that I think, Shaun Jackson brought up. I mean, he's, on one hand, saying this brother's speaking the truth, but like when you do that in the context, if you're not selective about that, then you're like, you mean he's speaking the truth about Florida? Is he speaking the truth about, whatever, Jewish people? And Stephen Jackson jumps in and say the Jews owed all the banks. And these anti-Semitic tropes that are just, I think are damaging, because a lot of people, if you can't get a bank loan and you're left to believe that all the Jewish people own the banks, what are you going to think about Jewish people? And if you look at the actual history of the civil rights movement, out of all the communities, who was the biggest ally of the African-American community? I would say it was the Jewish community. So he doesn't say that. So that's where, I think that's where the tension is, and that's where the problem lies. But you can't, I will never be one to just say, and I'm probably guilty of it too, I'm not going to just throw all of Farrakhan's message out because there's so much truth in there. But you have to pick and choose. And I think you have to call out what's not right. I mean, and there's some things that aren't right. Because you know what? I don't want somebody talking about African Americans that way, or in sort of a stereotypical way, because I would find that hurtful and insulting, and something that I would hope people speak out against. And particularly in this moment we're in now, you want people to stand up for justice, we have to all stand up for justice. So I know that's what you're going for, Joshua, but that's it.
No, I mean, that's perfectly fine. But I also believe that at the end of the day, if you're going to call a spade, put the right justification and the right punishment or consequence that goes involved with you putting that spade out. And and where I'm going with this is because Shaun Jackson got a suspension. Obviously, the team handled the suspension. I forgot exactly what it was, but he got suspended for his comments. Okay, we understand that. But a guy like, I think his name was Riley Cooper, who used to be he called players the N-word.
The N-word.
And he only got 1 day of practice. So
I can't remember how that went, because I'm telling you, got a little more there. But whatever it was, I mean, that's something. That point I wouldn't argue. If those are the facts, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's wrong. It doesn't make the other thing right, but that would be wrong, right? You know what I mean? That's wrong too, right? No, I'm absolutely right with you there. And that's what Stephen Jackson was trying to say. But in the process of saying that, he dragged this other stuff into it too, right? I mean, when Stephen Jackson kind of leapt to Shaun Jackson's defense. And me, I'm like, I hate writing this, you know why? Because as a football fan, I love the Shaun Jackson, right? And something about how quick he is, and I just always enjoyed watching him play. And I just felt like he was kind of in a place where, in some ways, he didn't even understand what he was saying, because he was literally pointing to anti-Semitic things, saying, "I'm not an anti-Semite." But I'm like, here's this Hitler quote, and except for statement of Hitler quote. It's just kind of a bizarre situation. It's probably one of the perils of social media. You needed to just not be speaking to the world at that point, But you're right. I mean, I think there's a power in the Jewish community too that that people see. You know what I mean? So, but you want everything to be handled equally. If someone's going to use the N word, there should be punishment for that too. No one was going to. No, I wouldn't argue with that.
All I ask is that the NFL moving forward, please get it right. That's all I ask the NFL. Please get it right and make sure equal justice, even from a consequences perspective, goes along the way. We're currently on the line right now. We have ESPN's Michael A. Fletcher. Transition to this topic for me, Mathur Maker, who is a top 20 recruit. He chose Howard University. And he's the first top recruit to eventually join an HBCU commit in school. But then you have also other HBCU news where we talked about earlier. Senator Kamala Harris just been nominated as vice president, and she's the first Black Asian American to do so. And on top of that, the first of other things, first HBCU grad to do that. The first Black American age woman to do that. First sorority, part of the AKA sorority.
AKA, right.
So, as the son of an AKA, I know my mother's extremely excited about the situation. But talk about how these paths, these new movements, these new trends of Black empowerment, especially Black women empowerment, how it plays a role in not just politics but sports as well. And talk about how those connections can play a big role in creating an advancement for the African American community, not just in entertainment, but in the overall as a society.
I mean, I think it gets back to the point I was trying to make before about sort of supporting our own, right? If we have some institutions, we don't have a lot of power in this society, granted, but we have some power. And damn, like if we can't control basketball, I mean, come on. I mean, we this is a game, basketball and football, our sports dominated by African American athletes. And seeing Mathur Maker go to Howard, I worry that he's not gonna have a chance to play because of COVID. This is what I really worry about. I hope I'm wrong. But you see how things are lining up, you wonder, if he plays, there probably won't be fans. But let's just hope for the best. But seeing him go there, the kind of money he can bring into Howard University, TV revenue, that kind of thing, is, would just be phenomenal. I think for his perspective, the experience of being on a campus with, vast majority Black students, people who, presumably are going to have more of a relationship with you than you're just a star athlete. Like they're going to be, just into your head more, just more like, oh, you're Mercure, what's going on? What's happening tomorrow? Not just, you're just the big star, like you might be at UCLA or at, name the Power 5 school. I mean, I think that's powerful. And young people who see that, particularly if Mercure is successful, it won't be a big risk for them to go to a Howard or go to a North Carolina A&T, go to a North Carolina Central, go to a Florida A&M. Because, is Florida A&M really not a better school than, say, Ball State? Or, or just name a lot of these top schools. Maybe the very top schools, you can argue, well, okay, they have all these facilities and stuff. But there are a lot of schools that are a cut below, say, the Dukes and the Michigan States that, a lot of brothers, talented top players are going to. And you got to wonder, are they really getting more out of this deal than they would get out of it if they had gone to an HBCU? And they have their presence at an HBCU can draw revenue, sort of build pride. You see how winning programs build, for any school, build the number of people who apply. That creates money for a university, and it just becomes cyclical. Look at Clemson. Where is it, Clemson, right? Somewhere, name the town. It's somewhere in South Carolina. But that place, they won some national championships in football. And it's like a huge, it's a huge phenomenon, right? People want to go to Clemson from all over the country because they see Clemson playing football, come bowl season. And you could do the same in basketball. You could do the same in football, too. It's harder. And so that's part of it. And then if you see Kamala Harris, Howard University, hey, yeah, she's on, Democratic presidential ticket. That takes away that, whatever, if that's in people's heads, like somehow Howard is less than. How could Howard be less than if this sister went to Howard and listened to her talk, listened to her hold her own in the political arena? That it doesn't even become an issue anymore. No one's even thinking about that. There's that pride, like you said, your mom's proud. Shoot, my wife's not even a sorority. She's proud. She was asking me, yeah, Delta or AK, I can't remember. I think she's, you know, I mean, it's infectious. You know what I mean? And I think, you know, hey, you know, I have a granddaughter now. Like, you know, I mean, it's cliche-ish to say, but it's great to see her, you know, be able to look up and say, wow, you know, that woman I see on TV, she may not even recognize, you know, realize who she is. She's so young, but there's this black woman who seems important on TV. And that's empowering. And to know, and later she'll learn that lady went to a HBCU. And I think, you know, it builds kind of a self-esteem and a pride, and also builds revenue and sort of real kind of power for us. And we can, and it's there. That's what I'm talking about. We have that. We have that in our clutches. We just need to bring it together.
And I think it's important that obviously you have these big trailblazers like Mathura Maker and Kamala Harris are really becoming for the Black and the African American community. But I think it's also important for professional athletes to also continue to encourage and empower those people within those trailblazers and encourage others to join that path. A prime example is Chris Paul, because Chris Paul has been wearing HBCU gear and shoes, game shoes, the whole time he's been in the bubble, and he's really putting a lot of plug to at least HBCU schools that not many people across the country really pay attention to.
I know. He had some shoes. I was like, who are the Rams, man? Like, there was like one school, I can't remember. Listen, I can't remember, Alabama A&M. Somebody was like, I couldn't identify the school, you know? I mean, he's been wearing, you know, HBCU swag like every game, which, and again, it's a simple gesture, right? But Chris Paul we're all the sports fans are watching this stuff in the bubble. Millions of people are seeing him do that, and that has to help. I mean, it's not going to make all the difference in the world, but it certainly helps a lot. You know, it helps. It moves us in the right direction. And so, can you imagine being a student at one of those schools? You know, you feel a little, you know, you get a little, you know, bounce in your step, you know, because how often do you get that kind of shine? So, I mean, and it's those simple things, and it's basic community stuff. Like, this is ours. Like, this is our community. This is not knocking somebody else or taking away from whatever, Duke or whoever. This is building ours, you know, and that's how you get stuff done. That's how, first of all, that's how people respect you at the end of the day, because, you know, you have yours. You don't have to answer to somebody. You do it your way, you know, and as long as you have produced good results, who's going to be in a position to criticize? So I'm all for that. I love seeing it. And I'm glad you can see through the years, finally, athletes, this activism has become kind of part of the mainstream of pro sports, and I don't think it'll ever change, you know, and these brothers, they have the smarts, they have some money, they have some independence, and they're putting it to good use. I'm glad to see them doing that. You know, I used to be like in the old days, I used to read stories about cats or someone robbed their locker at $200,000 worth of jewelry. I'm like, how do you have $200,000 worth of jewelry? You know, and but it's nice to know that, you know, people are like doing stuff that I think is going to help the broader community.
Do you actually believe that we're in a time now where if you are a superstar athlete and no matter what sport you play, you have a legit obligation to promote your community, especially if you're part of the minority community or more specifically, as us Black brothers talking, African American community? Do they have an obligation to utilize their platform to help create the social change and the social justice they want to see within their communities? Is it an obligation now?
You know, I almost hesitate to say obligation, but I think almost, yeah, you know, almost, yes. I mean, far be it from me, like, you know, people are going to live their lives the way they see fit. But I think there is kind of a responsibility to do that because they have so much, man. And it's because the community supports them that I think that it really is the right thing to give something back. And it's not that hard to give back. And when you have that kind of platform, you can do it pretty easily and have an outsized kind of impact. I would love to hear these brothers talking more about voting, you know, talking more just about community building and supporting one another and just some basic stuff, man, that young people I think would be enlightened to sort of hear, you know. talk about how we could help, sort of build our communities, help one another. It's not, rather than being rivals of one another all the time. Let's stand together and kind of how beautiful that would be, how powerful that will be. I mean, back to Farrakhan. Farrakhan talks about that. That's why people stick with him even through some of the other stuff, which may be more controversial or they might not even agree with, because he's talking about this stuff. And I think people are hungry for that kind of message. I think, you see, that's why there were 1 million people at the Million Man March or more, or maybe it's 1.5 million. That's why Farrakhan could pack, the United Center. He used to pack Madison Square Garden when I lived in New York. I think it's that part of his message, and I think our community really wants that. And if athletes have kind of a platform, and again, like I said, I don't want to say it's their obligation, but it's a responsibility I love to see them step up to, and increasingly they are. I mean, like I said, to me, the epitome of it is LeBron James, like probably the most popular athlete, and certainly in the NBA, maybe in like top 2 or 3 in all of sport, right? And I mean, that brother, for a brother, I mean, it doesn't even matter. Like, you almost forget the brother didn't go to grad school, the brother didn't go to undergrad school, but he has a brilliance about him, and the way he handles himself, and the way he thinks about stuff, and the faith he seems to have in himself, and even what he's doing with his friends in terms of building businesses, with Rich Paul, and who's his other boy? The guy is I forget his name, but
Matt Carter.
Yeah, Mav, right, exactly. And how could you not respect that? So I mean, I think that becomes a template for people, and you see a lot of young athletes, I think, who look up to that, and they want to emulate that. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that.
Oh, most definitely. Like you mentioned, LeBron James. I mean, he's even playing a role in the voting aspect. He got a campaign more than a vote.
That's right.
So he's putting where his mouth is, and you have players like Dwayne Wade and Carmelo Anthony, Chris Paul, that came together to put together a social justice fund to help give back to the communities and help promote social justice change. I just hope that more athletes continue to follow those same paths to give back to the communities, especially us as black males and black leaders of this country. I think that's really powerful. Real quick, one final thing I have to ask you, because I did write a piece on this as well. It's a little old, but it's still relevant because of the fact that, Mathur Maker finally did make he's making his transition to the HBCU world, which is something that's unheard of. I actually advocated and believe one person that really should consider doing this is LeBron James' son, Bronny. Now, Bronny's in the same class as Mikey Williams and those guys. I want to say in the class of 2023. Don't know for sure, so don't quote me on that.
He was just a freshman, right? So it'd be whatever that is, right? 20, yeah.
I think
it's 3, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the same class. But they're in the same class as Mikey Williams and those guys. And Mathur Maker talked about how he wants to get other recruits like Mikey and those type of recruits to go to Howard, or at least go to the HBCU route, so that way he could continue really being a trailblazer for this trend that we all know is necessary within the African-American community. I think Bronny James will be a perfect candidate for that because, you already got the black history, black background from his dad being such a huge supporter of HBCUs and a huge advocate and trailblazer and activist and icon really for the African-American community as a whole. So he's already socially conscious. He already has the history and support of his dad. And him going to an HBCU would change the revenue game completely just because he is the son of LeBron James. And on top of that, he can create his own legacy. He can create his own legacy within an HBCU because that's what HBCU schools provide, is the opportunity for you to be yourself and create your own path through African-American ways of academics. And Bronny James, I believe, can really change that demographic by being a guy, the son of arguably the top 3 best player in the history many have. And to see what he's done and to create his own legacy throughout his own way and his own path, what other way would you want to do it as a top recruit to go to an HBCU? I just think that would be an ideal situation for him. What are your thoughts on that idea?
Man, I'm with you on that one 100%, man. Could you imagine, I don't know, I think North Carolina Central already offered Bronny James, right? Like, could you imagine, like, I don't know, some Christmas tournament, North Carolina Central, Bronny James, I guess it's a 2 guard or whatever, and who's sitting at mid-court watching? His dad, right? LeBron James is there cheering his son on, and maybe Dwayne Way's there to lend some support, or whoever else. I mean, that would be huge. Whether or not Bronny James becomes a fraction of the player of his dad, just the fact of who he is, that name and sort of what it would represent would be a game changer for HBCUs. And maybe he'll do it. I mean, knowing LeBron James, who knows? Unless Bronny James proves to be like a guy who doesn't have to go to college to play pro ball, but he may or may not be that guy. I don't know. It's hard to tell from his freshman year. But if he goes to college to play basketball, I would put a 50-50 chance he ends up at a HBCU right now. And it could be even greater than that. And that would be, I mean, everything you just described, Joshua, that would be it and then some. And you're talking about being like knocking down the doors and setting a trend and creating a template for other people. That would be what would happen there. I think you'd see a lot of people going there. And it would just become the norm. Not that guys wouldn't still go to Duke or still go to UCLA, but you get your share of guys going to, HBCUs, I mean, to me, why shouldn't Howard be as good as Georgetown at basketball? VC, why is VCU better than Howard at basketball? I mean, why? I just could never understand that, So why you can see Loyola Chicago to the Final Four?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. A nice crew and everything, but come on. So.
No, that's truth, man. That's truth, man. Where can everybody find you on social media? I know you got to have social. I know you have to have.
Yeah, I'm such an old man. I do have social media though, but it's at Fletch Post on Twitter. That's my main vehicle. And I'm on Facebook like an old person. I would just lurk on Instagram. I don't post anything. I just lurk, and follow people and stuff. But at Fletch Post is my main vehicle. That's where I post all my stories and, repost and retweet things that I find interesting.
What you got coming up next?
Oh, actually, a piece about Jay-Z and the NFL.
Wow.
I'm going to send you that when it's done. It's going to be a couple of weeks. Yeah, you kind of put that on my mind, I have to tell you.
Okay.
So, we're trying to pull something together now. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that.
It's a tough one. Like trying to deal with NFL and trying to deal with Rock Nation, man. It's like trying to get stuff out of CIA. We'll see.
Right. I hear you, but but for you to hear that I helped inspire you to write this, that really means a lot to me, especially as you being a mentor in the industry. So I really appreciate that. I can't wait to read it because I know you're going to kill it. And for the audience, obviously he's going to share it with me, but I will share it with you all when that article comes out. And you can follow me on Twitter at jhicks042 and on Instagram at that guy Josh Hicks for more of not just my postings, but what this guy right here, Michael Fletcher, is willing to share with us regarding that story and all things future that he's writing with the Undefeated at ESPN. And with that being said, Michael, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Thank you. Love to have you come on anytime. And I can't wait to see what you got going on moving forward. And eventually we're going to link up. I'm going to come to D.C. We're going to link
definitely,
up.
Man. Once COVID's over, man, I usually get around the country, man, but I haven't been anywhere in I don't know how many months. This is getting crazy. My wife's sick of me. She needs me to get out of the house. So
I feel you, man. Whenever you can, wherever it is, we're definitely going to link up for sure.
Yeah, no question, brother. I've enjoyed it, Joshua. It's great, man.
Oh, thank you, man. Appreciate you. And we'll talk soon.
All right, sounds good. Take care.
All right.